Okay, guys, and we're back for another video where we're recently seeing that Anthony Joshua is saying that he wants to return against a top 15 opponent in early 2026. Now, there are a few names that have been put out there. Of course, the Tony Yoka fight, if that gets made, I think Anthony Joshua would be pretty an easy win for him against Tony Yoka, and he'd probably run through Tony Yoka in terms of what both guys are at this point in their careers. But there's some other names that have been put out there that I think potentially could be even more interesting fights than Tony Yoka. And would really be a better test of where Anthony Joshua is truly at this point in his career. Names like Gassiev, names like a Jagbar, Deontay Wilder, Filip Hrgovic. Now, these guys may prove to even have a step too much for Anthony Joshua at this point in his career, but these are the type of fights that we need to see Anthony Joshua in next to understand how much he's really got left at world level, or, because he may have nothing left at world level, which is very possible in my opinion. But we'll go through some names here. I'll start with the last name that's been sort of suggested, and that's Murat Gassiev. Now, Gassiev, even now, is really one of my favourite boxers, or really fun boxers to watch. But back when he was at cruiserweight, this guy was a phenom. And people don't talk about Gassiev enough. They sort of, because it was when Usyk was cruiserweight champion, people sort of disregard the cruiserweight champ division, and like, it was only really Usyk that was there. No, Gassiev was there. Gassiev was a serious fighter at cruiserweight at one point. Serious fighter, and in my opinion was not as much of a boogeyman as Usyk, but a boogeyman. Guys weren't lining up to fight Gassiev. Let's have it right. Guys were not lining up to fight Murat Gassiev at cruiserweight. That being said, he has lost to Usyk, and he has lost fights since. He probably has been at cruiserweight, probably spent too much of his career at cruiserweight and waited too long to make that move up to heavyweight, and now that he's sort of far removed from his physical prime, he's now fighting at heavyweight, which isn't really a good sort of balance. You know, you're already past your prime, and now you're fighting guys who are bigger and more powerful than the guys you're used to fighting. It's not really a good mix, and Anthony Joshua would by far be, I'm imagining Anthony Joshua would be the biggest guy that Gassiev has ever fought, and no doubt the most powerful too. Like I said, both guys are pretty far removed from their prime, but still, I think Anthony Joshua's still got enough power to keep someone like Gassiev honest and use that size and that strength to make the most of it, and probably beat a Murat Gassiev. And that would actually be one of the best wins on AJ's resume as well. Because Gassiev, like I said, having a name like Gassiev, a guy who accomplished what he done at cruiserweight, was an undefeated world champion at cruiserweight. You know, that's not easy to do, even at that time in cruiserweight. Now that cruiserweight division isn't as stacked as the current cruiserweight division, in my opinion, where you've got Jaya Pataya, Zerdo, other guys as well. You know, a number of other guys. But yeah, we'll see. I don't think that Gassiev fight's likely, because Gassiev's not a big name, and Anthony Joshua at this point, I imagine he'd want to be fighting the biggest names he possibly can, because he's a veteran at this point. He doesn't need another rebuild job. He needs to go in there, get the biggest winnable money fights he can get, and that's how he ends his career, until he loses one bad loss, and that'll be it for him. So I don't think that Gassiev fight's likely, even though it would be a personal favourite of mine to see. Then you've got F.A. Jagbar. Now, it seems like F.A. Jagbar's just sort of moved on from that fight against Martin Bakole, where I would think, surely, after that result, they'd be running it back for a rematch. But clearly not, because it seems like both guys are sort of happy to move on, and Jagbar's willing to move on, and Bakole's looking to go on to bigger and better things. But yeah, an F.A. Jagbar fight could prove quite tricky, because F.A. Jagbar is quite a big heavyweight, like Anthony Joshua, quite muscular, but also quite athletic, and very well could prove to be more athletic than Anthony Joshua, particularly early on. Right, we saw how athletic F.A. Jagbar was at the start of that fight against Bakole. He did tire towards the back end of that fight. And if you tire like that against Anthony Joshua, to be fair, Anthony Joshua's not got an amazing gas tank like that, and he's not getting any younger. You know, Anthony Joshua's best performance was against Usyk for 12 rounds, and even by the end of that, he was blowing out his ass. So Anthony Joshua is not the type of fighter that's going to go 12 rounds and, you know, can push the pace for 12 rounds the same way an Usyk or Tyson Fury can. Anthony Joshua's not that fighter at all. So if a Jagbar can almost do to Anthony Joshua what he done to Bakole, where he can win those early rounds, and as long as he can survive the back end of the fight, he can win a decision, I don't think FA Jagba could do that to Anthony Joshua because we saw early on in that fight, Martin Bakoli was a far more stationary target than Anthony Joshua ever would be, right? Anthony Joshua's not a boxer who's particularly defensively elusive. He's not particularly a great mover in terms of footwork, but he's better than Bakoli. He moves more than Bakoli. He's more athletic. He can get in and out of range quicker than Martin Bakoli can. So in that instance, I might even have to give the edge to Anthony Joshua. Now, you're looking at it and thinking, see, these are sort of the names that are in and around the top 15. And if he beats Gassiev, if he beats a Jagbar, the next name we've got here is Deontay Wilder. I think he handedly beats a Deontay Wilder. Then we're looking at guys who are really in the top 10. We're looking at guys that are really in the top 10. But I'm going to break down that Deontay Wilder fight, what I think that could happen there. Now, honestly, at this point in 2025, I struggle to see that fight being a stadium fight, in my opinion. I don't think it's the type of fight that could sell out a Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, that could sell out a Wembley. Not anymore. If this fight happened 6 years ago, even if this fight happened, 3 or 4 years ago, that fight probably could have gone and done Wembley, gone and done Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. But both guys are just far too removed from their prime. Now, maybe if they did a supercard there at Wembley and they had, I don't know, Eubank Jr. v Ben 3 and they had Moses v Wardley on there and then they had Wilder and Joshua. Now that could be a gigantic British show. But them two headlining a stadium, Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua, I don't know. I don't know if that sells out Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and Wembley at this point. But I think it easily does the O2. Easily. Anthony Joshua, even at this point, Anthony Joshua by himself could still sell out the O2 right now. At one point, he could do it by himself at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, which is when he was at his peak celebrity. Right? But he couldn't do that now. But he could do O2. He could do O2 against Gassiev and Jagba and sell that out comfortably, in my opinion. Could do the same with Deontay Wilder. But out of all these guys, Deontay Wilder's by far the easiest fight because his boxing fundamentals are so poor. They're so poor. And I've never, honestly, I've said this before about Deontay Wilder, but I've never seen a boxer get worse. I've never seen a boxer get worse the longer his career goes. Now, you see boxers get slower or lose power or lose chin. But in terms of technique, he's gotten worse, and it's weird because I'm seeing, old Deontay Wilder title defenses, and sure, he's not a super slick boxer by any means of the imagination. But he had a 1-2. He had a 1-2 that was effective, that he could throw, and if he could do anything, he could throw a 1-2 right. But now it looks like he's just janky and gangly, and he can't even do that right. It's really weird, but I think this would be a super easy fight for Anthony Joshua. As long as Anthony Joshua's chin can hold up. Deontay Wilder's lost a lot of his power, but he's not lost all of it. Because even now, the way Deontay Wilder still throws punches, now yes, it's ugly, it's gangly, but he puts his entire body into those punches. Right? And it's an Anthony Joshua who's been stopped multiple times at this point. Taken 2 beatings from Usyk, got dropped by Klitschko, stopped by Andy Ruiz, and stopped by Daniel Dubois. Can he take Deontay Wilder's punch? And that's what makes this fight interesting, even now. Because yes, both guys are far removed from their primes, but the questions that we had back then are still the questions we've got now. Because both guys are past their prime. They're both at similar levels. I think Anthony Joshua is still operating at a much higher level than Deontay Wilder is. Because Deontay Wilder realistically loses to pretty much every boxer in the top 15 right now. Every one of them. But he wouldn't fight, those fights wouldn't get made. But a fight against Anthony Joshua could get made for Deontay Wilder. And for both guys, that would be their last big payday. And I'd imagine that would be it for them. Because Wilder's never working his way to an Usyk fight. Anthony Joshua's not getting a trilogy with Usyk. And he's not going to rematch Daniel Dubois. Maybe an Andy Ruiz trilogy. Maybe. And the only other fight that would be worthwhile for Anthony Joshua would be a Tyson Fury fight. Now, that's the only fight for Anthony Joshua where he could do a Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. He could do a Wembley. That's the only fight that Anthony Joshua's got that could do a Wembley. Tyson Fury. Right? These other fights can't do that. At all. At all. So, Deontay Wilder, I think he beats Deontay Wilder. And then you've got your Filip Hrgović's. Now, this is a hard one. Because Filip Hrgović, out of all those guys who I've previously mentioned, Filip Hrgović is by far the best boxer on this list. Right? By far the best boxer. But Filip Hrgović is a guy who has been stopped by Daniel Dubois. So was Anthony Joshua. And Anthony Joshua was stopped in a far more devastating fashion than Filip Hrgović was stopped. Filip Hrgović had success in that fight against Daniel Dubois, but Daniel Dubois was just far too powerful. Right? Now, Anthony Joshua probably doesn't have that same level of power anymore, in my opinion. And against a guy like Filip Hrgović, Anthony Joshua isn't going to be able to sit down his punches the same way. Because Hrgović is a very high-level boxer, and he's always going to be moving. Now, is he as high-level as Usyk? I don't think so. I don't think he's high level, and I don't think physically he can do what Usyk can do in terms of applying pressure and the angles and the footwork and, all these things. That being said, he's still a very tricky boxer. And a prime Anthony Joshua probably could have caught a Filip Hrgović and finished him. But this is Anthony Joshua who's far past his prime. This is Anthony Joshua who's not as fast, not as powerful, not got the chin he used to have. That being said, Filip Hrgović, it's not like he's a monstrous puncher. He dropped David Adelaide, but he's not a devastating puncher. But at the heavyweight division, if you're against a guy who, and you can land clean on him, and you can land clean, you sit down on your punch, you can drop anyone. Because at the end of the day, Filip Hrgović is all of, 240? 240-pound man hitting you in the head. There's only so many things that can happen, and getting knocked out is one of them. There's only so many things that are going to happen, and getting knocked out is one of the possible outcomes. Right? But there is a part of me that thinks that Filip Hrgović now still has more to offer than Anthony Joshua at a world level now. So I would actually pick Filip Hrgović to beat Anthony Joshua. But I'll be curious to know what you guys think of the names that I've sort of put out there. Some interesting names in my opinion. Some names that would still be pretty decent money fights for Anthony Joshua and still opportunities for him to get big paydays. And at the end of the day, a guy like Anthony Joshua, he'd just be looking to pick up wins at this point. And they need to be against respectable names, if we're being honest. They need to be against respectable names because Anthony Joshua is going to want that on his legacy. He's not the type of guy that's going to want to go out against journeyman and sort of cruise his way to retirement. And Anthony Joshua will be the type of guy that he'll want to go out with a bang, for sure. Whether that's him fighting a Deontay Wilder and beating him and then retiring, or him fighting a Tyson Fury and probably getting outboxed and then retiring. But I think Anthony Joshua goes out with a bang. But I'd be curious to know what you guys think. Like I said, of those names that I've put out there, Gassiev, Ajagba, Wilder, and Hrgović, I'd be super curious to know what you guys think of those names. Do you think Anthony Joshua's capable of beating those guys? Or do you think those guys can sort of outbox Anthony Joshua and work a game plan that will be effective and get that dub against Anthony Joshua on their resume? I'd be super curious to know what you guys think in the comments below. And another episode of the Seth Solo Side Quest in the bag, and I'm out. Peace.